and address a range of social needs, including education, health, social protection, and job opportunities, while tackling climate change and environmental protection. One thing that is important is that both in academic and in policy circles, there is a growing acknowledgement that these goals cannot be reached without the deep engagement of multinational firms. Now, this, of course, leads to other questions. So how should this deeper engagement be triggered? How can a virtuous multinational firm government collaboration be developed to pursue the Sustainable Development Goals? To discuss these questions, I'm joined by 4 leading academic, business, and policy experts on the topic. The first person is Maria Alejandra Gonzalez Perez, who is a full professor of management at Universidad EAFIT in Colombia and previous vice president of the Academy of International Business. We next have Kyle Salvant, who is resident senior fellow at the Columbia Center of Sustainable Development, also AIB fellow and previous director of the UNCTAD Investment Division. We have Bruno Vermoosen, who is the head of Office Governmental Affairs for Circular Economy at BSH Home Appliances Group, and also chairman of the board of directors at Recupel in Belgium. And we have Wang Yi, who is associate professor of international business at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. So I would I'd like to welcome all of the panelists. My name is Ari Van Ash, and I'm a professor of international business at HEC Montreal in Canada. So to start the discussion, I would like to turn first to Alejandra, who has collaborated with several Latin American and Caribbean researchers to understand sustainability challenges in that region. So Alejandra, can you please fill us in of the major findings of your research and perhaps how COVID-19 has influenced these trends?
Thank you, Ari, and thank you, UNCTAD, and thank you, IB, for the invitation to this panel and to the World Investment Forum in general. For me, it's a really honor to share the space with such a wonderful panelists, Professor Suvan, Professor Wang Yi, and Mr. Bruno Vermoosen. Also, I want to thank my colleagues and co-authors, Miguel, Manuela, Camila, Carla, Fabiola, Cynthia, and Indiana, and whose work I'm sharing with them, with you today. So Ari, before answering your question, let me highlight that the Latin American and Caribbean region has 33 sovereign countries. That one might be something that many people don't realize, and we additionally have another 15 dependencies of territory. So we are talking about 48 countries, and there are over 660 million inhabitants. So, and our region is really diverse in terms of historical, cultural, geographical differences. And within regions and between, within the region and between the countries in the region. And for several decades, they have been discussing the structural characteristics of the region, especially in things that have to do with the region development, dependency of commodities, and also, this growth linked to commodities, the low productivities. And in fact, the founder of UNCTAD, Mr. Raul Prebisch, he analyzed that since the 1950s and aimed to solve that at the first UNCTAD conference. So, and for more than a century, the region has faced political, social, economic, environmental crisis. In terms of political crisis, the country has a lot of corruption, guerrillas, dictatorship, and social unrest have been taking place, forced displacement, terrorism, violence against women, land concentration. We also have unemployment, informality, low productivity. And regarding environmental crisis, it centers on deforestation, air pollution, and we have earthquakes, hurricanes, droughts, volcano floods. So positively, we can say the Latin American and Caribbean region has survived sequences and sets of crises and various level of complexity. But basically, Ari, the region has grown and big environmental challenges, environmental, socioeconomic. So let me go fast on 9 of them. So first, the climate change vulnerabilities. So because of the region has 17 of the regions in the planet, in the region has the highest terrestrial biodiversity. From the 17 largest countries in the world with higher biodiversity, 6 of them are in Latin America. And the region hosts around 60% of the entire global terrestrial life. In terms of global marine biodiversity, it has a large concentration within the Caribbean and within the Mesoamerican coral reef. And with the regions have different biomes that have wetlands, mangrove, coral reefs, desert, tropical forests, savannas, glacier mountains. And so we have a lot of endemic species. Plus we have the Amazon rainforest that absorb between 20 to 25% of the annual carbon emissions. We have on environmental degradation. This is really bad. Deforestation is one of the worst threats in the region. South America accounted for 1/5 of the world forest area, but deforestation is really bad. In the 1990s, Brazil has 70% of the territory forest cover, and it right now is just below 60. We have poor economic resilience of lack of this diversification. Several of our countries depend on intensive extraction of natural resources. 1/3 of the exports of the region are commodities. We also have inequalities. The second more unequal region in the world after the Middle East. We have this oncoming debt crisis. We have several historical currency and external debt crisis since the 19th century. We have also digital divides. There are several countries within our region that less than half of the population are internet users. And that one is even more complicated in remote areas in where geographical conditions can make infrastructure very challenging. Plus we have the financial and logistical limitation for people acquiring equipment. We have dysfunctionality in political systems. We have this perception of reality of lack of state presence, state efficiency, and lack of credibility in institutions. We have unsustainable urbanization. 82% of the population in the region resides in cities. And the country faces a lot of dilemmas in terms of how to manage and maintain its sovereignty over natural resources. And that one is going to be even more challenging from now because of the biological and natural capital of the region. So how we can manage that and to promote at the same time sustainable and economic growth. And how the pandemic has aggravated, well, basically everything that I have mentioned has been going worse with the COVID-19. And we are pretty much in an intersection of several crises, and they are already start to be more and more visible, Ari. So the challenges for our region are huge, but also the opportunities because of the richness in terms of biological and natural capital. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. So from what you indicate, it's very clear that there are tremendous amounts of sustainable development challenges in the Latin American region and the Caribbean region, and indeed COVID has only made it more severe in many of these areas. So let me actually, so governments, of course, have played a key role in trying to address some of these sustainability challenges and incentivize sustainable investment through regulation. A great example of this is the European Union's concept of producer responsibility in waste management policy that aims to get companies involved in strengthening the circular economy by reducing overconsumption and designing out wastes. So Bruno, how have companies in Belgium's electrical and electronic equipment industries reacted to extended producer responsibility regulations? And do you believe it actually helped generate a circular economy?
Yeah, thank you, Ari, and thank you to the AIB and the World Investment Forum for this opportunity to be part of this panel, of course. Belgium is a very small country, especially in the world, but also in Europe. It's a small country, and even Europe is a small region in the world. So I think let's focus on Europe instead of Belgium, because most of the environment-related legislation is developed on a European level. So the extended producer responsibility principle was introduced in Europe many years ago. We know it under the Waste Framework Directive, and more specifically on the waste of electrical and electronic equipment, which is a legislation that makes, let's say, producers of electrical and electronic equipment responsible for the end-of-life phase of their products. It is a horizontal piece of legislation which was addressed to the member states of the European Union, who had then to transpose it into national law. And what we have seen is that actually the industry has very well reacted to that principle of producer responsibility. In most of the countries, with the exception of Germany, collective systems have been set up. Collective systems where different industry players from different sectors, be it the white goods, of which my company is a part of, but also ICT equipment, lighting, power tools, small equipment, toys, etc., have set up systems which take over actually their responsibility in the field of collecting waste appliances. So these systems, collective systems in most of the cases, organize the collection of the waste appliances and organize then also the treatment of the waste appliances. So that is a very important contribution in collecting waste and in treating waste according to certain standards. Standards that have been fixed by the European standardization bodies, CEN-CENELEC, which have set a certain minimum quality requirement for the recycling process. Also within that European legislation, collection targets have been set that have to be reached. Also recycling and recovery targets are fixed and are enshrined in the law. And that has led, of course, to initiatives that contribute to the circularity, to the circular economy. Unfortunately, we see that this system is not only working well, but it also fails. And it fails because actually the principle of producer responsibility is, of course, very interesting if you start from the idea, the concept that waste has a cost. Treating waste has a cost. And what we see is that waste does not necessarily have to be a cost. We see that certain waste streams in the electronic and electrical equipment has a benefit. Yeah, for example, white goods, large white goods, with the exception of fridges and freezers, of course, they bring money in recycling. And then, of course, parallel markets start to raise, and you see that other actors have interest in those waste streams, collect them and treat them themselves, unfortunately not according to these high European standards. So a lot of cherry picking is being done, and only the interesting materials like metals, for example, are taken out, and all the rest is either burned or dumped. And that is a failure, a flaw actually in the European legislation, while the legislator is too much focused on the producer, forgetting that other actors also have a shared responsibility. So there is, I think, a lot of potential that if we could include all those other actors, not by taking away them, not by taking away their business. This is something that we accept, yeah, that we have a free market on new products. We also should have a free market on waste. People may earn money with waste. We don't have any problem with that, but they should, of course, comply with the same rules than we as producers have to comply to. And that would, of course, be a massive improvement, let's say, of the legislation, and would increase the contribution to the circular economy. But besides waste, of course, also Europe is very strong in regulating, which is actively being supported by my company and by our sector. For example, the regulations in energy efficiency done by the energy label, done by the eco-design regulations, have contributed, let's say, to increasing the efficiency of the appliances by also phasing out the least performing appliances. And we see now that even under the eco-design regulation, there is a transition from energy efficiency, because we are regulating this already since more than 20 years. There is a transition from energy efficiency to resource efficiency. Yeah, where under the eco design regulation, producers, let's say, are set minimum requirements, are set information requirements in order to inform the end consumer about, let's say, the resource efficiency of the products that they buy, and to again phase out the least performing appliances. And we see that first directions going into the direction of repairability, availability of spare parts, increasing repairability, which is a major contributor to the circular economy, that because it leads to lifetime extension of appliances. Yeah, and of course, other regulation more in the field of materials and substances is of course also contributing to that. The ROS legislation, REACH, might be known already now throughout the world. And then recently with the new commission that was installed 2 years ago, we have the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, the Circular Economy Action Plan. All those, also in those initiatives from the European Commission, which is the body that can make proposals for new legislation, we see a total shift to resource efficiency, not only on energy efficiency, where issues like repairability, durability, reliability, recyclability, recycled content, information requirements, digital product passport, all initiatives, let's say, to improve communication towards the end consumer, raising awareness with the end consumer, and on the other hand, let's say, stimulating the industry in doing better. Yeah, and these are initiatives, let's say, that as a company we can support if they are, of course, well formulated in legislation, if they are supported by good measurement methodologies, strong standardization, and then, of course, a strong enforcement also afterwards. We cannot hear you, Ari.
No, sorry. So thank you very much, Bruno, for your comments. I think that they raise a lot of interesting issues. So the first issue, of course, is that it demonstrates the link between regulation and innovation. Countries or companies in countries had to react to the regulation to come up with a new way of doing things. But it also demonstrated that regulations can often have side effects that maybe were not being thought of as much in advance, and that we have to be thinking about as well, how you have different stakeholders that might be acting or reacting differently to these issues. So these are great points. Just for the audience, if you have any questions or you want to follow up on some of these points, so you can certainly put your comments or questions in the chat, and we will be having time at the end to address them. I do want to go a bit further here, and this is a question more for Wang Yi. So indeed, one of Bruno's points was that environmental policy can push companies to innovate, and as a result of that, regulation can matter to attain sustainable development goals. Wang Yi, you have actually done an in-depth study on the impact of environmental policy on green innovation in multinational firms. So what were your main findings in that study?
Thank you, Ari, and thank you for this opportunity. Right, indeed. My co-authors and I conducted an in-depth study, and I think this study will have a very nice conversation with Bruno's narratives on how firms respond to environmental policies. Before I report our findings, let me first explain what our research is about. By in-depth, I mean an exhaustive research and search of innovative multinationals in the world, and specifically those firms with headquarters in large economies that also have a strong trading relationships with each other. Excluding incomplete data, observations, etc., we eventually focus on 6 economies. These are France, Germany, Italy, US, China, and India. So we have economies with this combination of developing and developed economies, and we focus on multinational firms originated from these economies. So our study identified nearly 600 multinationals, and their 5,761 majority-owned revenue-generating foreign subsidiaries. These units, for the non-IB audience, these units are called foreign subsidiaries because they operate worldwide beyond the 6 home countries. So the purpose of studying these multinationals and their active subsidiaries is to review if location-specific environmental policy is driving green innovation of foreign business entities, and which policy instruments work best. Although individual countries and the government generates own innovation policies, environmental policies, as well as using a whole different set of policy instruments, what we need to know urgently is, in addition to the knowledge that this kind of environmental policies affect the domestic firms in the country, how do they shape the nature of foreign direct investment? And these inward foreign direct investments are effectively the operations of foreign subsidiaries of multinationals. So we achieved this by studying the green patents of these globally dispersed foreign subsidiaries after controlling for influences of various factors and the fact that it takes time for policy to exert their effect. We sought to find if a more stringent host environmental policy is more likely to be associated with the green patent output of these subsidiaries. In technical terms, we used the OECD's green patent classifications and analyzed more than 450,000 patents and more than 3 million inventors associated with these subsidiaries and their innovation. We further used the OECD Environmental Policy Stringency Index and to capture the differences between countries. And in our case, of course, it is the differences between the host countries of these multinational firms. Our findings first confirm that, yes, green policies can bring about a green innovation of foreign entities, but not all kinds of green policy instruments work. In fact, our study shows that there's only evidence of a positive impact of a market-based instrument, market-based environmental policy instruments. In other words, host countries and market-based environmental policies have been driving the innovation output of multinational firms' subsidiaries. So in conclusion, government actions work, especially increasing environmental stringency works, and the market-based instruments work even better. And they work because innovation is risky and requires incentives, especially the prospect of commercialization and a critical mass in the number of participants in the market. This relates back to Bruno's discussion very nicely. Bruno was referring to not only the producers, not only a specific set of firms that are expected to take up a policy, and we need a whole range, including consumers, to have to generate that sort of demand for better, more efficient technologies. And so green patents, that, like other intangible assets, have a higher added value, not only to the firms that orchestrate their global value chains, but also to host economies that can draw on the potential in increasing green productivity and international technology transfer. So stopping at this note, I shall now pass back to Ari. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wang Yi. So I've certainly noted down, as you indicate, that once again, yes, we do know that regulation can have an influence on the green innovation of companies, but, and a bit in line with what Bruno was saying earlier, we have to be careful by not seeing this as a general statement. We have to bring in nuances, looking at the type of regulations that matter, and also looking at how different stakeholders are being affected. So I did note down your focus on market-based instruments, which is quite interesting. So I want to turn now to Carl. So Carl has been thinking a lot about types of policies that can help drive sustainable foreign direct investment. He had a recent article in the Journal of International Business Policy where he's focusing on this issue. I saw this week another article from his center on this topic as well. So Carl, the question that I have for you is, so you've been advocating that governments should be adopting a more proactive green industrial policy to encourage more sustainable foreign direct investment. Why do you believe this is necessary, and how would this work? And if you could also comment perhaps on what Bruno and Wang Yi have pointed out, that would be great as well.
Thank you very much, Ari, and thank you for being able to participate in this webinar. Well, let me first try to answer your question of why is it necessary for governments to be proactive, and then turn to how it would work. And I think Wang Yi's presentation in that respect, but also Bruno's presentation in this respect, is very instructive, because they seem to indicate that there are ways to make regulation work to achieve certain goals in the context of sustainability. Well, for me, the starting point is that multinational enterprises seek to maximize their competitiveness in a global context, while governments seek to maximize the sustainable development contribution that foreign direct investment can make in a national context. So there's a clear tension between the interests of governments and multinational enterprises. Let me just give you an example of this tension focused on taxation. And we are all familiar with it. And we all know that, of course, without collecting taxes, governments can't make the many actions that are required to advance the sustainable development goals. So governments seek to collect taxes from multinational enterprises. But of course, multinational enterprises seek to minimize their tax burdens through all sorts of actions. The interests of the two sets of actors clearly diverge. And they have diverged so much that, as we know, 136 governments just reached an agreement on how to limit tax base erosion and profit shifting by the largest multinational enterprises. So given the difference in the interests of governments and multinational enterprises, the challenge becomes, I think, from the perspective of governments, how can you get multinationals to align their activities as much as possible with the SDGs? And specifically, how can you get multinational enterprises to undertake sustainable foreign direct investment? So my focus is relatively narrow. It focuses on foreign direct investment. Let me give you a few examples of the actions that governments can take to get MNEs to align themselves with undertaking sustainable FDI. And by the way, one of the questions I have for Wang Yi is, it would be interesting to hear from you which policies are actually the ones that worked. So maybe later on, you can expand a little bit on this. Now, as I mentioned, I wanted to give a few examples of policies that one can pursue. Well, I mean, one is that governments can mix incentives and rewards. An example is the idea of creating the special category of the recognized sustainable investor. Governments could say, if you want to be able to be classified as a recognized sustainable investor, you have, for example, to observe the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises or the Ruggie principles on human rights. And you also have to make every effort to maximize certain sustainability characteristics in your activities in relation to your foreign affiliates. And in return, as a reward, you get special treatment. Special treatment could be, red carpet treatment when you enter a country, or you get a project officer assigned who helps you throughout the life of your investment. So it's a mix of incentives and rewards. In the more specific context of bringing about carbon neutral FDI, And as Ari, as you mentioned, we just published a perspective on this topic. We suggest various measures that could be taken to focus carbon neutral FDI. And given that climate change is one of our biggest challenges, I think it may be useful to think more about that. Let me mention three. The first one is, and I'm just very brief, governments could incentivize carbon neutral FDI through financial and non-financial measures. Two, governments could incentivize, and I'm talking about host country governments, they could incentivize or even require foreign affiliates to be carbon neutral. That could be a very important avenue to pursue. And as we know, by the way, a number of countries have, a number of companies have announced that they want to be carbon neutral, maybe not including their supply chain, but it would be a first step. Now, these two examples focus on actions that host countries can take, but home countries too could take action to advance green FDI. For example, they could link their support for outward foreign direct investment to investors observing home country climate standards. Or they could prohibit that actually high polluting industries are being relocated to developing countries. So these are just some examples. And I think it's really up to us to see what else can work. And the type of research that Wang Yi mentioned is particularly helpful in this respect. Let me close with a quote from an article on the carbon tax crackdown in the October 9 issue of The Economist. And as we know, the Economist is not exactly, is certainly not suspect of calling for too much government intervention. And I'm quoting now. Businesses, as a rule, do not like being forced to do anything. They prefer to make voluntary gestures, just enough to keep governments off their backs. It stains credulity to think that altruism is enough to convince firms to act. Governments will have to apply the thumb screws. I guess if we don't want the decade of action to be wishful thinking, we will need to ask governments to make determined efforts along the entire spectrum of voluntary to mandatory actions. And I guess that mandatory actions by governments may well become increasingly necessary. Back to you, Ari.
Thank you, Carl. So actually, I see that Bruno has his hand up, so I'll let him quickly interject, and then I'll move on to a next section of this panel. Go ahead, Bruno.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Carl, for your very interesting intervention and the quote from The Economist. And I would like, it's exactly that what I would like to jump into. That is that I agree with what you said, is voluntary action, at least in our industry sector, which is the sector of household appliances in Europe. We have had several voluntary actions, voluntary agreements even made within the industry in the field of energy efficiency, for example. But at a certain point in time, we have decided as a sector, not as a company, but as a sector, to stop those voluntary agreements because we could not ensure full market coverage. And then actually these voluntary agreements changed in a request from our industry sector for regulation, exactly like you said, because we saw the need in order to guarantee the level playing field, yeah, that the ones that were not subscribing to the voluntary agreement were actually free riding, not from the legislation, but from the voluntary agreement, of course. Yeah, and they created a market, a certain market benefit for them because their standards were substandard to the voluntary agreement. And that's why there came a clear call from our industry sector for regulation, which had led to the eco-design framework in Europe with its implementing measures, setting minimum requirements like we did to ourselves on a voluntary basis, but then enshrined in law. That was, and those minimum requirements were phasing out actually the least performing appliances. Yeah, so we see, and there I agree, that like you said, or like the economist said, that altruism may not be the solution. I think there has been very good voluntary movements in different industry sectors, which may be still existing today. But I think that a lot of industry sectors have come to the conclusion that that doesn't work. Yeah, that we need a certain minimum regulation, which, and there I agree with what you said before, stimulates, let's say, the industry to improve and stimulates the industry to further compete. And the regulation needs to allow for proper competition amongst the actors and needs to ensure a level playing field in the treatment, let's say, of the concerned actors by a proper enforcement. And then that's a system that might work. It's theoretical. It's in Europe more or less in place, but I think that this is something that we should strive for.
I guess can I come in, Ani? Just to quickly react. Obviously, we are exactly on the same line. I guess the challenge is to see how long can you wait for voluntary action, because a number of things can be achieved through voluntary action. And when does it become necessary to take stronger steps? And I guess in the context of the climate crisis, we probably can't wait that much longer in order to move forward.
Thank you, Carl. Actually, I do want to dig a bit deeper into some of the issues that Bruno talked about just now. So ultimately, right now, there are growing calls that multinational firms need to be deeply engaged in trying to attain the sustainable development goals, which means that government regulation or government action by itself cannot be sufficient. And so, Bruno, you have suggested that right now many leading companies are actually focusing on 4 Ps. The first P is, of course, a profit or sustainable profit or competitiveness, but other 3 Ps are people, planet, and prosperity. So what do you mean with this? And what does this imply for companies' engagement in SDGs? You already did mention that there might in the beginning be some voluntary willingness to do things, which does lead to a unlevel playing field. But what are some of the other things that they might be doing?
Yes, I think industry, or my industry sector, my company's, let's say, main SDG, what we are looking at is I think it's the number 12. It's sustainable production and consumption. It's the main target. And actually, yes, the 4 Ps: people, planet, prosperity, and profit. And we can say that, of course, profit is a part of the prosperity, because the prosperity is reflected to the company, of course, and profit is a part of prosperity. Are the drivers? Yeah, let's say, as Carl has said, in the frame of what is happening to the climate, what is happening to the environment, yeah, the criticality of some materials. We see it, supply problems in materials in the car industry. Even in our industry, we have problems of supply. Of course, and all the other elements, environmental aspects, which are threatened by our technological evolution. We as companies, let's say, need to step away from, let's say, from the concept where we want to market as much without taking care of what is happening to our climate and our environment. And this is actually what we, with our company, are doing. And we need to, let's say, to give more and more attention to what I have called societal centricity drivers. It's a concept on which I'm currently working. I call it societal centricity. Many of the companies, they are consumer-centric oriented. They look at what the consumer needs, but I think we have to go beyond that. We have to look at what the society needs, and no longer only the consumer. Of course, the consumer is important because he buys our products, but what does the society need? We need to look at what is happening around us. Yeah, what is happening to the environment? What is happening to the climate? What is happening on legislation level? What is happening on consumer level? Yeah, you see movements like the Fridays for Future we had here in Europe, or like the Yellow Jacket movement in France. these are all elements that we as an industry need to take into consideration, yeah, so that we do not only take care about our consumer and our company, but that we take care of everything which is around us, and that we take every element into consideration. And that is what I call societal centricity. And you have many drivers for this societal centricity, and we need to find those drivers. We need to focus on them, and then we need to balance out the organizational structure of our company in order to take care for that. And what is important is that we shift to a new model of cost calculation, yeah, where now costs are mainly calculated based on what is development and production, what are logistics, and what are overhead costs. We need to go towards a life cycle cost calculation of our products, actually, which is being done by the European Commission when they are doing studies on eco-design for certain products, by the way. Also, we as a company need to shift to that. And that will then automatically lead to new business models that we need to set in place. New business models that may even arise before the life cycle cost thinking, or the other way around, but new business models are needed. And we see, and that's what we are doing with our company, is we try to find alternative models where we do not only produce, sell, and then we don't care, and then we will see what happens, and then we have the producer responsibility systems that take back the appliances and do recycling. But we are going to new business models where we bring products on the market as a service, where we remain owner of the product, which allows us to interact with the product over its entire life cycle, and which responsibilizes ourselves to, let's say, develop our products in another way, so that the environmental impact of our products and the climate impact of our products can be reduced, and we can manage that. Yeah, and that is a new way, I think, which is needed for businesses to reflect about the activity if we want, let's say, to sustainably reduce our environmental footprint and our carbon footprint in society.
Thank you very much, Bruno. So maybe later I'll get back to you and ask how perhaps the government can help you, help your industry or your company in actually further pursuing this viewpoint. Of course, they can be facilitators, sometimes also restrict certain things. So that would be very interesting in the discussion. But before that, I would like to turn to Alejandra and ask, what do you actually see about this interaction between government regulation and how this influences companies, and how companies perhaps are helping to try to address some of the climate change challenges in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Ari, thank you again for the question. And I mean, the role of business action, like either voluntarily market-driven or compulsory regulated by markets in Latin America and the Caribbean, is increasingly visible. And by the way, it's not only in our region. The role of business is really increasingly visible. And it was, as it was presented by Wang Yin with the green patterns, or by Bruno with the link between regulation, innovation, and the importance of societal centricity, or Professor Suban that comment and emphasize that altruism is not enough, and the importance of government combining incentives and reward. You all might know that it's very little that has been done or explored in academia, in business and government regarding the relationship between a strategy and the responses to business responses to climate change and the strategic choices that companies might take. And especially within Latin America and the Caribbean, where we really need to have an immediate but a smooth and organized transition to climate change. So there is a lot in terms of developing innovative adaptation to climate change and lowering emissions economy. However, we need within Latin America, like, to develop further organizational internal capabilities that will enable companies to adapt. That one, another thing that is quite important in here is the importance of business networks and alliances. And that one is because amongst themselves, or business among themselves, they can influence each other in this adaptive behavior, either market-driven or peer-driven. In other words, I mean, companies, they don't adapt in isolation. Well, when they have a regulation, that's one thing, but it's like when there is no regulation, they don't adapt in isolation. And basically, I mean, we know that no business is an island. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are communities of practices and business networks that facilitate the initiative to accelerate innovation, to reduce uncertainties, and to promote the co-creation of knowledge in terms of contributing to advance the adaptation to climate change. But like those networks are basically, the main role is learning from each other and finding potential development and developing together capabilities and capacities for climate adaptation together. Like when we talk about emissions, for instance, if we look at scope 3, where there is very importance of aggregating the impact of countries. So in the study that I mentioned, or that Ari and I mentioned in the beginning of the first question, that we conducted with Miguel Cordova, with Freddy Coronado, Manuela Gomez Valencia, again, Camila Vargas, Carla Navaguirre, Fabiola Monge Cueto, Cintia Vilas Boas, Calisto Caccini, and India Minto Coy, all of them members of ABI in Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Jamaica, Mexico, and Peru. One second, sorry. Mexico and Peru, and that we use future scenarios methodology. We found that there are means of implementations that identified by those that participated in the study that regarding the possibilities of the private sector and how they can contribute to improve the conditions, these developing challenges in Latin America, but especially looking to having a region that is climate resilient and adapt easily. So one thing is like, it was the redefinition of firm purpose, and that means like to align business strategy to the 2030 agenda. The other thing is like the exercise of corporate citizenship and business activism. I know that that one has a lot of elements of altruism, but in many other regions, it has elements of regulation. The other thing is like how we can make sure that the financial sector prioritize the sustainability criteria. Other one will be a strengthening relationship with local stakeholders, adoption of regenerative business practices. That one is another concept that I think that we have to get more within the agenda, the concept of regeneration, adopting climate change risk and opportunities, responsible investment, and green investment, as it was presented by the other panelists, and the increasing power of companies in measuring the return to society of environmental, social, and governance investment, and to try to measure the impact on society. So on the 31st of October, the COP26 will begin, and that one is like, it's expected that governments are going to propose more ambitious emission to reduce target to 2030. And that one is like for many countries to achieve net zero emission target by 2050. But for not only for companies within Latin America and the Caribbean, but that one will have to, many companies will have to begin their impact or their physical risk in terms of the risk of extreme weather events, but also measuring the current emission, assessing the transition risk. Those costs, how much will cost the company, financial cost of the company to adapt to the requirements to reduce emissions or to be net zero, and like identifying the priorities and implement and measuring. So the Paris, within the Paris Agreement, there is this element that is called the nationally determined contribution, or the NDCs. And this one, the NDCs are the targets that every country commit, based on their individual conditions, and they should reduce. So in the case, for instance, in countries in Latin America, in the COP21 in 2015, we have, for instance, Colombia, it has an NDC of 20%. That needs to reduce 20% its emission by 2030. And in COP26 is going to adopt, or like actually since December 2020, adopted 51%. but that means that companies must align to the national NDCs. I mean, companies operating in the countries. And most of these MDCs are going to be achieved by regulation. I mean, through penalizing excess of greenhouse emission, or to put a price on carbon, or provide incentives of carbon offset. But these countries in the region, I mean, like many of them are not going to have the financial resources for technological upgrades to reduce emission, or to adapt to natural disasters, or at the same time, there is plenty of opportunities within the region. Then at the beginning, I mentioned this issue of our opportunities, but at the same time with sovereignty, because there will be many countries and many companies around the world, and like, doesn't matter how much emissions they reduce, they are going to have to compensate, I mean, to have offset. And that one is where there are a lot of opportunities for Latin America, because of the nature-based opportunities in our region. So we have to attract FDI investment. I mean, we have, the Amazonia have a great, huge potential to be a CO2 compensation. Also, we have opportunities in terms of issuing green, social, and sustainable bonds. However, the LAC region participation in this market is still really, really small. It's only 3% of the global green bonds issuance is in Latin America. And thank you. So basically, I mean, it's like we have to we transit already from CSR to sustainability, but I guess we have to transit right now from sustainability to regeneration, Ari.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. So I do want to get to a last topic. So we heard Carl starting his initial remarks, indicating that there is perhaps a divergence between what governments want and what firms want. And then we heard Bruno indicating a bit later that actually there is a movement towards, or at least there's a hope that there is a movement toward societal centricity in the thinking of companies. So if you look at that, what it seems is that there is a possibility of collaboration between government and multinational firms. And this is also a point that Alejandra was pointing out when she was indicating the importance of networks, and which always has a collaboration element. So I'm going to ask a question to Carl, but Wang Yi, you'll be getting a question that is quite similar, which is, Carl, where do you see opportunities for collaboration between MNEs and governments to advance the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thanks, Ari. Well, since the focus is on collaboration, I focus obviously on intergovernmental collaboration, and I think there are many opportunities. And I think this collaboration takes place mostly, not only, but mostly in the context of negotiating treaties on foreign direct investment, including especially treaties dealing with investment facilitation. Let me give you 3 examples of such negotiations, which are all negotiations which are actually taking place and where I think real opportunities exist to move our agenda forward. The first example is that the European Union Commission has started negotiations with Angola, I think about 6 weeks ago or so, on an investment facilitation treaty. And I think I would expect that other countries are quite likely to follow in negotiating investment facilitation agreements with the European Commission. And therefore, it's important to get it right, that actually the focus is not just on facilitating investment flows in general, which is important for a number of reasons, obviously, but also to give special attention to facilitate foreign direct investment that makes a direct contribution to sustainable development, that is sustainable FDI. These negotiations, by the way, are also important in the context of the investment protocol that will accompany the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been established, and the negotiations on the protocol are supposed to start any day if they haven't already started. So I think we have to make sure, not we have to make sure, I mean, we obviously have no influence, no direct influence on these negotiations, but I think it's important that these negotiations facilitate not only foreign direct investment in general, but give special attention to the facilitation of sustainable foreign direct investment. So that's one example. Another example, and a very important one, are the negotiations in the WTO on an investment facilitation framework for development. These negotiations are far advanced. Most of the substantive issues, the technical issues have been agreed, and it's expected that the main elements of such an agreement will be available, will be ready by MC12, by the ministerial conference at the end, which starts at the end of November in Geneva. But highly likely that the negotiations will continue next year. And these negotiations are focused entirely on technical measures to facilitate FDI flows in general. And the expectation, of course, is that higher FDI flows make a contribution to development. On balance, of course, we can all subscribe to that. But I guess, as I mentioned already, or as I indicated already, could one nudge negotiators to focus not only on general investment facilitation measures, but also on facilitation measures that encourage sustainable foreign direct investment, including by creating more linkages between foreign affiliates and domestic firms, to upgrade domestic firms, to link them to global value chains. Or also in the context of the WTO negotiations, the issue of corporate social responsibility and responsible business conduct is being addressed. Perhaps one can, encourage negotiators to not only talk about these principles, responsible business conduct, but also require that certain voluntary international instruments like the OECD guidelines are being observed. And there may be a number of other things that one could do in order to make sure that this type of collaboration between government results in at least partially moving the agenda of sustainability forward. By the way, it looks as if the investment facilitation framework for development might actually be perhaps even the first time that sustainable development and sustainable investment is actually addressed in the WTO. And finally, my third example where I think there is room to exercise some influence are the negotiations of international investment agreements in general, bilateral investment treaties, free trade agreements, including, of course, regional free trade agreements. One could include a provision in these agreements to facilitate green foreign direct investment, to be defined, of course. Or if we want to be more ambitious, one could make carbon neutrality a criterion to define investment that is protected under a given bilateral investment treaty. And there are other possibilities. As you know, these agreements increasingly establish joint committees to discuss mutually interesting issues. Obviously, one could think about trying for these committees to work out applicable green FDI standards for investors and investment from one country into the other. So there are quite a number of possibilities where I think some movement is possible. All of these negotiations are important. They are ongoing. And I think we need to see how we can help governments to get it right. This is important not only because the resulting agreements establish obligations for the treaty partners, but also because they set parameters for domestic policies. And as we know, these treaties are enforceable. So I guess in conclusion, I think we need to give close attention to such collaborative efforts and to try to help to make sure that they pay particular attention to facilitating sustainable foreign direct investment for sustainable development. Back to you, Harry.
Thank you very much, Carl. So sustainable development goals are very often global public goods, and it does indeed, as a result, require international collaboration. And so we certainly have seen in your remarks that the general trend of trade and investment agreements moving away from only talking about trade and investment is certainly can be pushed further to look at how to deal with these sustainable development goals. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn now to Wang Yi, and I'll ask a similar question, but slightly different. So, Wang Yi, is there a real prospect, and this is going to be, of course, a very difficult question, is there a real prospect of aligning multinational firms for the decade of action? And if so, how do we achieve that? So I'll let you answer. In the meantime, if any of you of the panel or of the audience has questions to ask, you start thinking about these things as well.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you for the opportunity again. My short answer, yes, there is a real prospect. The reason is that country-specific, or rather location-specific environmental policies can be effective in filling the gaps that a global agenda cannot address. Why I'm saying this? This is because, first, even though global agendas such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has the advantages of being a global and a coherent agenda, and the complexity of achieving environmental targets are known to be a key challenge. The challenge is so considerable because simply there's unlikely to be a sort of a one-size-fits-all solution. And secondly, because SDGs are ambiguous about the quantifiable environmental goals, and even more silent on the market prospects of achieving these goals. And so in these respects, environmental policies are very different. Environmental policies often target on a more tightly circumscribed policy area that has less ambiguity. We know that relate back to Alexandra's early remarks and narratives. Each region, each country will have their own specific SDG challenges, and the governments, local communities actively generate policy instruments specifically to focus on these. And naturally, we know that these policies generated by policymakers in a particular jurisdiction, and rather than sort of regulating the whole world. So environmental policy is very specific, very targeted. Secondly, environmental policies are most local because they align better with the local context and such as the local needs and the local constraints as well. So market-based instrument, therefore, can effectively incentivize businesses, private sectors, and as we observed in our study of the foreign subsidiaries, green patents. And here I should add that the evidence we have so far is in the context of a very limited use of a market-based green policy instrument because of the study periods in our study that covers only years from 2006 to 2014. And I say you can imagine that the effect of a wider use of a market instrument, especially because of a recent development, can be even more positive. That's something remains to be examined. So all of these mean that using market-based policy instrument is effectively the local implementation of the principles of SDGs and following relevant legislations. So to answer the first part of your question, Ari, yes, there is a real prospect. The real prospect is that location-specific environmental policies can be the mechanism through which we deliver on a global agenda. And aligning multinationals for the decades of action means that environmental policies need to be first specific and to local needs and constraints. And here we avoided the sort of the illusion of altruism and so on. And they need to be effectively, and they need to be effective policy levers and uptake by multinationals. How do we achieve that? That's the second part of the question. I think the key is therefore for multinationals and the governments to collaborate. Collaborate is a word that we often say, but in effect, I think it means first to really specify priorities. In the early discussions from our panel members, we recognize that naturally firms, multinational firms, have a different set of priorities as opposed to those of local governments and the communities. Multinational firms, being multinational, have their own constraints, and therefore, to clarify these priorities is a very important step for building trust and partnership. And secondly, of course, expanding the local markets, which will benefit the application of suitable green technologies first for the local challenges, local problems. And this can stimulate demand. This can encourage local economic actors to participate in such markets. And even better, I think there are cases in the various studies of innovation is that this sort of demands can help to create a new green market. And further, co-develop high value adding local green assets. And by the very definition of assets, this means to create something that provides not only the current, but also future economic benefits. And therefore help to create this long-term orientation rather than this short-term reactive sort of response from businesses to government regulations. And SDGs are long-term goals after all. And so all of these will result in a larger global market at the aggregated level with a larger number of market participants, and such markets at a global scale will help to revise the risk expectations about the green investment. I think many audience will relate to this, hearing a lot of recent concerns reported in the media about how the green investment have been reevaluated. And so with a larger market, it will enable firms to mobilize and internationalize. And this is especially important when a small local markets are not sufficient for justifying R&D investments, etc. So in conclusion, a strong green market prospect is the key to promote the reinvestment of the gains back to a sustainable future. And thank you for the opportunity. Back to you, Ari.
Thank you very much, Wang Yi. Carl, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Wang Yi made two highly tantalizing presentations referring to policies that work. So I want to repeat my question from before. Can you give some examples of policies that work? Because in the end, if we want to have an action, a decade of action, we are talking about policies, whether they be voluntary or mandatory. So I'm curious to hear, what are the three most important policies that you think governments might want to pursue?
Thank you, Carl. I was thinking of replying to your question just now, but let me say it now. Let me start with the technicality of the study, and then perhaps go a little bit more general. In the current study, we have this so-called Environmental Policy Stringency Index. It's an index, and therefore it's useful, but also at the same time, it simplifies a lot of things. But nonetheless, the index covers the two categories of policy instruments. And the first category, as you predict that is called a market-based instrument. These include taxes, tax on CO2, tax on diesel, and etc. And the second subset category in it is the trading schemes. Trading schemes and trading of green certificates, trading of white certificates, and the CO2 trading, that sort. And the next and the last subcategory is called the feed-in tariffs. And we know that the feed-in tariffs from wind energy and the solar energy, this sort. Well, the other category, broad category, is non-market instrument. And these include the standards, very much related back to Bruno's sort of examples of requirements for producers to address some of these sustainability goals and etc. And so, Kyle, as you can see here, I would say the prospect is that there can be more diverse market-based instruments. The fact that the current sort of index has not revealed more of instruments simply because the governments have not been actively exploring, and I think this is opportunity for multinational firms and the governments to really clarify their priorities to each other and to explore the sort of innovation in the prototypes, in facilitation of investments, in trading exercise, and etc. And to explore the sort of mechanisms that work best. First, to local markets, because only local communities benefit from the sustainable development, and then you can expect more demand for green technologies, for solutions, so on. But knowing that the market at the local level is not big enough, in most cases for businesses, this is where I think the sort of multilateralism will come in its real term, can play a great role in helping firms and the governments to play together. In that sense, it means not only multinational firms really work with the individual government one-to-one, but rather governments collectively and the multinational firms collectively should have that dialogue to start with.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. We are actually running out of time. So we had scheduled to finish the session in 1 hour and 15 minutes, even though there will be still 15 minutes for people to grab a coffee before the daily roundup, which is an academic daily roundup after this. So I just want to round up this session myself as well. I found this session highly fascinating, very highly interesting. So the things I've taken away from this is that, of course, sustainable development goals are a very important issue to address. We have tremendous amounts of sustainability challenges in the globe. At the same time, from the different presentations and discussions from different viewpoints, one thing that I took away is that regulation can work in incentivizing companies to help address sustainability challenges, but we have to be very careful and certainly understand well which type of regulations work well. Some regulations, market-based regulations, might work better, others might work worse. We need to understand how different stakeholders react to that. So that is the first thing. The second thing that we also have to understand is that so companies are taking into account societal issues, but again, companies themselves or even groups of companies cannot do these things by themselves either. I mean, giving them carrots and sticks can be helpful. They have some own wishes for changes at certain times as well. But in order to address these sustainable development goals, more is needed, and we need to be thinking further in how to do that. For the academics, this means developing more research papers about this. For policymakers, this requires us to think further about which type of policies are addressing the right problems. For businesses as well, so it requires creative thinking about how to develop this societal centricity. We should avoid thinking that looking at these issues is something that has to be done only at the national level. Some issues can be addressed at the national level. Many issues need to be addressed at the international level as well. And I think that Carl made some really interesting comments on this issue as well. And then finally, I think that one thing we need to be taking into account is that today's world is very different from the world 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The sustainability realities that we're dealing with are different as well, and the tools that we have are different as well. So we need to think outside of the box and really move towards new policy tools and new business tools that can get us to that. So so these were kind of my final remarks. This is the beginning of a discussion. You know all the names of the people that talked today. Contact us. You can ask for our business cards in the conference, or just find us on LinkedIn or email us, and we will be very happy to continue this discussion. I love this presentation and this panel. Thank you all to the panelists, and we will see each other soon again.